So hello to everyone, and we've already heard very moving stories from people who've been affected by social media in all kinds of unimaginably terrible ways. And now we have a panel of experts. We're going to be talking about how social media disrupts our children's communities, and I'm going to start a timer here because we're going to talk for about half an hour with our panelists, and then we're going to have question and answer. So if you have questions toward the end, we'll have about 10 minutes of questions. So first of all, starting with Imran Ahmed. Imran is the founder and CEO of the Center for Digital Hate US and UK. He is an authority on the social and psychological malignancies of social media, such as identity-based hate, extremism, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. And he is an expert on how bad actors use digital media to harm others and to benefit themselves, by the way, as well as why the platforms allow them to do this. And he also advises politicians around the world on legislation. Next, we have Laura Marquez Garrett. Laura is a 2002 Harvard Law graduate. She was in private practice for many years on the defense side. She's an expert in electronic evidence discovery and forensic investigation. And last year, she joined the Social Media Victims Law Center, which seeks to hold social media companies accountable for the harm that they inflict on vulnerable users. We have Lynne Harris. She has worked in many fields, nursing, law, public health, politics. She's taught everywhere at every level. She was elected to the Montgomery County, Maryland School Board in 2020. That's the 14th largest school district in the country. And last year, they made the very tough decision to join school districts around the country to sue. It's a lawsuit against Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all of the websites for the harm that they believe is being caused to the mental health of their students. And finally, Dr. Mitch Prinstein. He is the Chief Science Officer of the American Psychology Association. He's a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's the co-director of the Winston National Center on Technology Use, Brain, and Psychological Development. He has spent his career studying behavior and mental health in children and adolescents, and he has often served as an expert to government and has testified many times before the United States Senate. So with that, let's dig right in. First, a personal question just for each of you. The internet was supposed to be this wonderful tool that would connect and inform all of us. When did you realize, come to believe, that it was having a different and potentially more negative effect on kids? And Dr. Prinstein, I'll start with you.
Sure. We've been doing research on adolescent mental health for so many years, and a lot of the focus of my work has been on suicide and non-suicidal self-injury. One of the things that was particularly shocking maybe about 20 years ago was the number of kids who were telling us that they had been directed online to sites that were teaching them how to cut themselves and engage in other self-harm behaviors. And moreover, these were websites that had communities that would punish kids for engaging in more adaptive strategies. Instead, they actually would teach kids how to conceal these behaviors from their parents. We started to realize that was just the tip of the iceberg. And of course, there are many other ways that kids' experience online was fundamentally changing the entire social context that they're developing in. And over the years, we started to unpack how that happened.
And Lynne, how about you?
Well, I would say, first of all, I really appreciate the young people here kind of echoing a message I deeply believe, which is no decisions about them without them. I would say, when I went through all of my educational background, and we won't go exactly into how old I am, but even when I was a graduate student in the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins, the use of social media was just beginning. And at that point, it was a great tool to help connect researchers and help those of us who were doing a deep dive on public health issues. And one of my big areas of interest was unintentional and intentional injury prevention. And of course, that involves suicide. I became more aware of the the truly negative aspects of social media. And when my own son, who will be 21 next month, was always a very active, outgoing, never wanted to be inside kind of kid. And he wasn't exposed to a lot of screens. We didn't have a lot of the sort of devices that other families seemed to have when he was young. But he would go to other kids' houses and they would, play these, get involved in these games online. And I noticed him being less interested in what he had always only been interested in, was being outside and running around. He wanted to be more inside and taking part in, playing, games with friends and that kind of thing online. And as a longtime advocate in Montgomery County, I had worked frequently with students on a whole array of issues, believing we go further, faster together. And I began to ask them, they were somewhat older than my son, what their experience of social media was. Did what I was seeing in my own kid echo their own personal experiences? And man, ask a question, you will get an answer. And I was really, that was very eye-opening for me, was really digging down and hearing directly from students their own experiences of social media and how that was impacting their lives. And I have a nephew who also, when I began to ask him about his experiences, and he's now 30, and as a gay kid growing up in South Carolina, that was not easy. But he had, again, getting to students, young people don't necessarily tell people. It took a long time for him to share what he was experiencing online. And I feel very grateful that even though he didn't feel comfortable for a lot of the reasons that these young people have shared, talking to his parents, he did talk to me. Yeah. And that was also incredibly eye-opening.
Thank you. And Laura?
Yes, thank you. So, I think like many people, I had no clue what was happening. And my kids were young enough that it didn't register. I was not an avid social media user myself. And so in January of 2022, I was introduced to our firm's founder, Matthew Bergman, and he allowed me to read his first complaint, which was about a beautiful young woman named Selena Rodriguez. And I want to say that name one more time, Selena Rodriguez. She was 11 when she died by suicide and posted that video onto Snapchat. A day or two later, I watched the film The Social Dilemma on Netflix. And at the very end of that film, a bit of a spoiler alert, but I'm sure most folks here have seen it, the producer asked some of these designers of these products, do you allow your children to use these products? And it wasn't just a no, it was a hell no, absolutely not, no way. As somebody who had been representing retailers, manufacturers, designers for 20 years on the defense side predominantly, but in business disputes, I had met many manufacturers, designers, retailers, and for example, if you design products at Adidas, your kid is usually decked out head to toe in Adidas. And so that for me was the light bulb moment when I realized not only are these products in fact hurting our children, but these companies know that they're hurting our children. A few minutes later, I turned to my wife and said, well, this is what we've got to do because they're coming for our children next. And I was at Social Media Victims Law Center about 25 days later. Mm-hmm. So for me, and I actually want to add one thing, that was almost 2 years ago. And I will tell you, we meet with kids, with families, we see this data every day. As a society, we are still just scratching the surface of what these companies have done to our children.
Thank you. I'm just going to interject a point here because I know you've all made this point to me before we go to Imran, and that is one of the things we talk about here is that this is not the responsibility of parents entirely. Parents do the best they can, some do better than others, but what we're really talking about here in this conversation is the accountability of the social media companies. And Imran, finally, when did you realize that this great promise of the internet was potentially harmful to children?
Well, first of all, can I just say to those speakers from before, Kristin, I'm so sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing today. And Ariel, Sydney, and Tricia, it was just really inspiring to hear you. I'm the first of 7, Sydney, and I'm an overachiever too, from a person of color overachiever. So I hear your stories so clearly. And I thank God that social media wasn't around when I was 17 years old. I think for me, it's been a slow realization. CCDH was set up 7 years ago when my colleague And friend Jo Cox MP, a 35-year-old mother of two, was shot, stabbed and beaten to death on the streets of Batley and Spen in England by a far-right terrorist during the EU referendum. And there is no more savage an introduction to the ways in which, you know, a malignant information ecosystem can drive people to the most extraordinary of places. But over that time of 7 years of running CCDH, it's one of those things. Parents just come and talk to me. They're like, you're the social media guy, hey? I'm trying to tell my daughter that she shouldn't have a mobile phone. She's 11. What should I say to her? And I say, I have no idea how to speak to children. It's terrifying. But then eventually we decided to look into it. And the first thing we did was a study called Deadly by Design at CCDH, where we set up as accounts as 13-year-old girls in 4 different countries, the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. And then we just recorded what the algorithm served them. Within 2.6 minutes of a brand new account with no other information than it's a 13-year-old girl, they're getting self-harm content. Within 8 minutes, eating disorder content, on average, every 39 seconds. And TikTok's response to that study was to block our ability to see how many times these videos, which had been seen billions of times, had been viewed. And is there any clearer example of the direct line between content harm and the shocking negligence of these companies?
So, so you mentioned the design, and that really is one of the most important questions we're discussing today. And not all of you have to answer this, but I'm going to toss it out and see who'd like to answer that. And that is, you know, we've established that this incredibly, shockingly toxic content is being pushed to kids. Do you believe, which I certainly think you've just said, Imran, that the design and the operation of these platforms is facilitating that process, that toxic process? You're nodding, Dr. Prinstein.
Yeah, without question. When we talk about social media, we're talking about many different kinds of platforms and many different kinds of experiences that kids may have when using those platforms. But we really need to think about that there are some features that are common. There's the content, which admittedly some kids may generate or go and seek out. There's also the functionality built into it, the like button, the follower count. And there's also the artificial intelligence. And that's where we need to take a perspective that's coming from psychology and neuroscience to understand what's happening. You wouldn't give a newborn a device to stare at all day long. You would probably be afraid that that might interfere with their brain development, or their brains wouldn't be able to handle what they're seeing on there. Actually, after the first year of life, the second most important time for brain reorganization and development is in the years just prior, the year or two just prior to pubertal development. We're talking about 11, 12 years old. That's exactly when most kids are first getting a device. And an area in the brain regions do not develop synchronously. They develop at different times. One of the first areas that develops is an area that makes kids craving through dopamine and oxytocin, any kind of peer feedback, any kind of rewards or fear of punishments. Social media, and I'm talking about someone who grew up in the days of busy signals and answering machines, but social media has created a 24/7 bar press opportunity for that social reinforcement. Now, importantly, this is all happening at a time when the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain that inhibits us from following every impulse, that has not fully developed. That will not fully develop until at least the age of 25. So at the very age when kids are biologically most vulnerable to getting peer feedback and seeking that, they're getting the opportunity to do exactly that with quantified metrics of exactly how successful they are at getting that. It is the perfect storm to create problematic social media use, hypersensitivity to what it is that they're seeing, and what we all see in kids today, staring at their phone constantly, picking it up and looking at it before they even realize what they're doing. This is very much tied into things like the like button and the follower count, and it's not just about the content.
Imran?
Well, I mean, that is a phenomenal insight into way that kids' brains develop, but I bet that all the parents in this room kind of already knew it, because we know that those teenage years, 14 to around 24, the transition to adulthood, are those years in our lives where we're learning norms, we're negotiating and understanding our values, we are hypersensitive to trends, our information resilience is low, and so misinformation has a particular effect. Look, 2/3 of 14 to 24-year-olds in the US and UK use TikTok on average for 90 minutes a day. And it's going up every
Did you say 90?
90 minutes, 90 minutes a day. And that's going up. So I've done so many of these talks over years and years, and you get asked, well, couldn't we send someone into a school to give someone a 60-minute lecture on information resilience and how to protect themselves? That's like saying that we're basically shoveling crack cocaine to our kids, but don't worry, someone's going to go in and tell them drugs are bad for 60 minutes. And that's really what we're talking about here. We've got algorithms which are incredibly addictive. Conspiracy theories themselves are inherently, fundamentally addictive. They cause you to rabbit hole. It's not just that they misinform you, they change the way your brain thinks. So, I mean, I couldn't possibly emphasize enough that the impact that we're having on our children, this untested experiment that no one agreed to, is having significant and enduring psychological impacts.
So we're talking here about disruption, and I'm going to come to you next, Laura.
Yeah, so now, and I just wanted to add on this, the pure data, right? So with the work that we do, we will pool these kids' data. So TikTok, for example, you can get their search terms for the last 90 days, I think it is. We see instances all the time where we see those search terms. We see 16-year-old boys who are searching for motivational speeches, uplifting content, Batman. And what they are getting, which we can then see on the account side, is what I've started referring to as literally, and this is hard to say and hard to hear, go kill yourself or someone else content. You see that data. These kids are not getting what they are looking for. More often than not, it's these companies that are choosing that content for them.
I think just to build on that point very briefly, one of the old canards about social media is that social media just gives you more of what you like. It doesn't. It gives you more of what it wants you to like. It gives it more of what keeps you addicted. It knows, it has billions, trillions of data points of how long people spend watching videos, what they click on, how frequently they engage with it. Let's not forget, these are engagement-based platforms that amplify according to engagement. They're giving you more of what keeps you on the platform. Their imperative internally is not edification or being effective in providing you with information when you search for something. It is about keeping you for as long as possible in a state of anxiety, of feeling inadequate, of feeling not good enough, of feeling that maybe if you just had one bit more of information from this conspiracy theorist, you'd finally understand the world around you. That's what their business is.
So we're talking about disruption so disruption is disruption of individuals, of families, of classrooms, of school districts, of societies. I mean, there's a lot of different types of disruption that children's communities are facing. Laura, let me go back to you for a moment, because the Social Media Victims Law Center, you represent more than 2,000 families, I think, who
That's
are suing because they have been harmed by social media. So what have you learned, again, about the operation? I mean, you've given an example, but that disrupts actual families.
How many hours do we have here now?
Yeah.
It's a laundry list, right? Quite literally, we could talk for hours about this. I'm going to focus though on one of the patterns that I think we saw early on, because it's something that many households are dealing with. It's the addiction piece, the dependency. And so, if you think about what addiction does to a 30-year-old adult, right? Now put that on a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old, no matter the age, we see the same outcomes. Whether, it's a 2-parent household, a 1-parent household, parents who gave their kid a cell phone, parents who didn't, parents who put software on, parents who, everything. We've seen every background, every ethnicity, every religion, and the outcomes are the same. And what we see with these young kids are this dependency piece, where you have a child who is either hiding their use from their parents or the extent of their use. They are lying to their parents, often for the first time in their life, and they don't know why. They can't sleep at night. If they don't have their phone, it's all they can think about. If they do have their phone, they can't turn it off. They are, and sleep deprivation, for anyone who's missed a day or two of sleep, it is bad in adults. It is worse in children. They're angry. They are angry when their parents try to step between them and that thing that they need. And then layer on top of that the fact that nobody knew what was happening. There was no transparency. There was no disclosure. So you have parents who are taking their children to every specialist, every doctor, every, nobody knows what's happening. We have, when we started this work, I had a doctor who called me and said, when parents came in and said, my child can't get off the phone, we used to tell them to take away the phone. Mm-hmm. And then we started having parents come back and say, my child killed themselves.
So that brings me to Mitch just quickly here, because we don't have a huge amount of time, and I wish we had an hour and a half. So in other words, if it is addictive, which you spelled out the way the brain works, is there actual withdrawal that could potentially take place if you take the kid's phone away?
Yeah, there have been a number of scientific studies now that have used the diagnostic criteria for addiction and dependence, but replacing the words for substance use with social media or technology use. Remarkable number of kids, over 50%, are reporting at least one clinical symptom of withdrawal, tolerance symptoms, or dependence. So in other words, as Laura's saying, kids can't get off even when they want to. It's interfering with their daily roles and routines and so on. We're seeing that it's really affecting kids' sleep, which is pretty critically important because the amount of sleep you get in adolescence determines the size of your brain growth and also that it grows in the proper way. It's interfering with exercise. It's interfering with how kids are perceiving mis and information and buying into mis and disinformation. They're being exposed to these harsh sites. And now there's some evidence suggesting that more frequent use actually changes how the brain grows. So a few years later, kids who are using it a lot are actually becoming hypersensitive within the brain regions for sensitivity, are becoming hypersensitive to more peer feedback, which creates, unfortunately, a vicious loop, because in order to satisfy that, they're going on even more. So we're really seeing that this has interfered with the development of the brain in such a way that might increase even further use.
So Lynne, your school district made the difficult decision, as we talked earlier, to join all these other school districts to sue the platforms for what you believe is the harm that is being done to children, families, classrooms, school districts. What do you hope to get through that lawsuit?
Well, we were just talking about this. This is not going to be a short process. I mean, many school systems across the country have joined one of the many ongoing lawsuits against these social media companies, and we're just getting into discovery, so it'll be years down the line before there's any result. But what I do hope is going to come out of it, we've seen, and I'm a former lawyer at the Justice Department who for a time worked on tobacco litigation, and I think what I hope we'll see is something around the same level of global accountability that eventually emerged out of tobacco litigation, the Juul litigation, other things where societal harms are being, the people who are benefiting financially from these societal harms are being held accountable in ways that, you can look at the fentanyl lawsuits that really affect the ability of them to continue to function as a company. But what I hope more is that these companies will see the handwriting on the wall, because I think the harm is real. I so appreciate, we have 211 schools in Montgomery County Public Schools. We have 164,000 students, but we have 211 buildings full of dysregulated kids. And they're dysregulated because their brain development has been disrupted by both, the effects of pandemic level, the pandemic isolation, but that is just, we have to move away from blaming everything that we're seeing now in education on the pandemic, because what we're seeing post-pandemic was present pre-pandemic, and there were certain aspects of that isolation and that pandemic anxiety that have exacerbated it. But kids, there's a reason that we are seeing more and more kids whose families bring them in and say, we need an IEP, we need a 504 plan. They have ADD, ADHD. Well, there's a reason for that. And that's because of this, the screens and the addictive nature of the screens, which you are talking about. And I so appreciate that science, because it's absolutely real. And, you know, in school systems, we see it reflected in academic performance that is not as robust as it should be. We're seeing it in difficulties in the classroom, and let's not even get started about the fact that 21st century education is very different than 20th century education. But I think state departments of education across the country are stuck in 1950s thinking on ed, and we need to reform the way we deliver education, just because it's a new world. But we're also seeing disruptive behavior. Again, a lot of people have blamed that on the pandemic, but if it is an after effect of the pandemic, a lot of that is because of the enhanced and excess nature of social media consumption during the pandemic. Just today, we have three of our high schools go into lockdown because of bomb threats, but we all know that a lot of that sort of disruption is caused by TikTok challenges and things like that, and students are getting those ideas to disrupt from their social media use. Oh, won't it be fun? It's a Monday. I don't want to go to school. Okay, call in a bomb threat. And I mean, we see it in many, many, many ways. But
So I want to talk just quickly about a couple of specific groups of kids. So I'm going to actually go to you first, Laura. LGBT kids, you know, social media has really been considered, you know, maybe a positive thing because it helps them find community, helps them express their identity. But what is the downside as you have seen it?
So I want to address the supposed upside first, because I do hear that sometimes, and I always like to ask, what have the social media platforms actually provided that the internet did not provide these kids before those companies came around? Because frankly, I don't think there's an upside, at least not a new one, not a unique one. So on the downside, it's that they're targeting our queer youth, that for these companies, sexuality, questioning, that's just one more data point that they can use. And we see it, you know, my younger colleague actually had the best, I think, example. She was from a conservative Midwest town, and she searched for gay pride in YouTube. And she said that for every gay pride video I got just as much, if not more, Westboro Baptist Church, you're going to hell. And those are the experiences that our queer youth are getting. And again, these companies are not providing them, aside from addiction, they're not providing them anything that didn't exist before they came along.
So Imran, we know we have a lot of data about the effects of harmful effects of social media on girls, body dysmorphia, you know, depression, suicidal thoughts, exposure to predators. What about boys? Has your research found?
So we've just released recently a new piece of research looking at the promotion of steroids, so anabolic androgenic steroids, SARMs, which are a different class of drug which is illegal to prescribe to humans, and peptides, and looking at how they're being promoted hundreds of millions of times by influencers who are trying to persuade young people to actually go and take those drugs. But let me tell you how they sell them, first of all. So the first time I met your boss, Matt, or your colleague, Matt, was bizarre, on the set of Dr. Phil, where he was sitting next to, I was meant to be debating the god of the godfather of male supremacism, and Dr. Phil had this focus group of moms and their kids. So it was the kids who were talking, 14-year-old boys, and they were all being asked, "What do you know about Andrew Tate?" And they were just waxing lyrical about this guy and how much they liked his ideas about strength, about masculinity, about muscularity, about dominance, about power, about relationships with women. And their moms were behind the one-way glass going, "What the hell?" Because of course, they had no ideas what their kids were watching. You remember that old PSA, it's 10 p.m., do you know where your kids are? Now you know where your kids are. They're on the sofa next to you, but you don't know who they're with. You don't know which algorithms are influencing them, are shaping the way they think. And actually, the impact on young men over the last few years, the studies that we've done looking at Andrew Tate and misogynist, masculine, misogyny, domination, power, especially physical power, the studies we've done into incels, the studies we did into steroid-like drugs, actually what we're seeing is that young men are being persuaded that the way to be real men is to be violent, and the way to be effective at being violent is to make yourself into Steve Rogers by taking steroids. And that's just another example of how underpinning all of what we're seeing, whether it's telling young girls that they're not good enough and they need to starve themselves to death, or it's telling young men that they need to build enormous muscles so they can beat the heck out of their partners, there is a fundamental misogynist strand that underpins the internet. My old mentor in civil rights, Eric Ward, used to say that underpinning every racism is anti-Semitism. Like if you scratch a racist, you find an anti-Semite. In the digital age, almost every malignancy we see online, you scratch it, you find a deep, abiding misogyny underneath.
I'm going to ask one last quick question because we're actually into audience question time. So, so forgive me, but I want to just kind of sum this up. You've given us such important insights into what the design and the operation of the platforms is doing to addict children, just push harmful content toward them and so forth. If you had all the access that you want, if the social media companies were required to be more transparent, what would you like to know? And let me start with you.
They could stop suing us first.
But yes, Elon Musk does not like Imran, so or the work that he's doing.
So the truth is the platforms have become less transparent over the past 2 years in anticipation of legislation in both the UK, the Online Safety Act, which should be passed into law this Thursday when the King signs it, and the Digital Services Act in the European Union. But they also know about COSA, so they've been making it more difficult for us to get data. But if we did have access to data, I mean, crumbs, you can't ask me for one thing. There is an entire shopping list of stuff that we need to know, we deserve to know. This significantly impacts the mental health, the physical health of our children, but also the health of our society, our democracy. You know, there's a whole range of work we do at CCDH, not just on kids, but also on identity-based hate, on threats to elections. And I just think right now we need Congress to actually stand up and give us a statutory right to data and transparency from these platforms.
And I'm hoping that the rest of you can work in your answer to that question when you answer the audience's questions, because we want to be sure that people in our audience are able to ask questions. So
my answer is what he said.
Yeah. So when you have a question, just raise your hand. There's people in the audience with microphones, and please identify yourself, and we'll start. So who has a question out here somewhere? Oh, is this a shy group? No. Oh, no. Okay. Sure. All right.
Hello. So Tony and Brandy Roberts from New Iberia, Louisiana, and hi, Laura, Glenn, and thank you all. This may sound brutal, but what in the hell is taking them so long? Because the research has been out there. We lost our daughter 3 years ago. How many more children have to suffer mentally? And how many more children have to die? And does it take for one of their children to suffer like this for them to get it? Why is it taking so long?
Does anybody like to take that question? Mitch?
So obviously there are different incentives for the folks who are in decision-making, who have decision-making authority. But I can tell you a couple of things. One is that I don't know what's taking so long for the legislators. I do know that tech companies are aggressively recruiting scientists who work at nonprofit universities, objectively studying these with remarkably lucrative offers to go work and actually increase user engagement on the platforms rather than learning about some of the potential benefits or harms on kids' development. And that's a huge issue. We invest remarkably little in the research on this topic, and we have very, very few people available to study this. The second thing I'll say is that there are a variety of steps that seem, potentially very easy to take. I can't buy a flashlight for my child without a package insert that says, don't use this in the bathtub, and other ways to keep yourself safe. But there's nothing, these are platforms built for adults. There's absolutely nothing that adapts the platforms to the experience of a less mature brain. There's nothing that warns them. There's no competency test built in, like a driver's test, to make sure the kids understand the pitfalls, the potential concerns before they get on and use it. And those are things that actually could be so easily, remarkably easily built into the platforms themselves. But there would have to be an incentive. And I don't believe that any of those things will increase profit. So that might be a very big concern.
Yes, always profit. Anybody else have a question? Yes, right there, sir.
Hi, I'm Danny Weiss with Common Sense Media. Thank you very much for all of your excellent testimony today. I know we'll talk more about solutions later this afternoon, but I'd be curious what you think. There are some people who would say, and Linda, you alluded to this, that this is not the parents' problem, it's the company. The burden should be on the companies to hold them accountable. But I'm curious, there are people who are pushing for bans, let's say ban cell phones in schools, ban children under 13 from being on social media, require parental consent for kids to be online under the 18. And then there are people who are pushing for requiring companies to change the functionality, Mitch, that you talked about, design and functionality. I'm curious where you each are on the question of better approach or a combination of these approaches.
Well, if I could take that very briefly from CCDH's perspective, there are lots of people think they have a silver bullet to this problem. And this is a systemic problem that has endured for in 1996, when that legislation was passed, I was my first year at college. I'm 28 years beyond that now, 27 years beyond that now. So, I mean, that's a long, long time ago. And the truth is that we do need a systemic response to a systemic issue, a systemic problem that's been caused in our society, that causes problems not just to the parents here, but also in a whole array of different areas. So what we've advocated for, keeping in mind the First Amendment is in place, and so a lot of the legislation that's been purported or promulgated today actually is a little bit, is unlikely to stand over time. Transparency is the first thing. You need to know what's going on these platforms. Transparency of the algorithms, of the economics, the advertising, and of the content enforcement policies. With transparency, you can have meaningful accountability to some sort of democratic body. Now, Elizabeth Warren and Lindsey Graham have got a bill suggesting a FCC for social media. Great idea. With accountability, then you can ask the platforms to take some degree of responsibility when they create harm. And that's crucial. So the DSA and OSB have got massive fines in place if they fail to obey the rules and if they fail to provide transparency and accountability. And what we hope that leads to, because by introducing responsibility, which means Section 230 reform, that you give them some skin in the game so that you create a culture in which safety by design isn't just something that parents advocate, but is economically in the self-interest of those companies too. STAR, STAR framework that CCDH has provided, that to us is the only way you're going to fix a systemic problem with a systemic framework.
Okay, one more question. We have time for one more question from the audience. Let's see. Oh, maybe we don't have any more questions. Is there a hand up somewhere? Oh, did I see a hand? Yes, back there.
Hi, I'm Julie Scelfo, and I'm the founder of an organization called Get Media Savvy, and we are launching a new initiative next year called Mothers Against Media Addiction to try and help more parents understand the nature of these problems before they face a critical impact in their lives. And I guess, my question for you, Mitch, and I know I've written about this before, given that social media platforms are not safe for kids, given that these platforms are unregulated, why aren't medical associations like the APA standing up and saying these are not safe for children? I don't think if we had roller coasters without proper protections to keep people safe, that the APA would say it's okay for them to use. If we had cars without seatbelts, I don't think the APA or the American Academy of Pediatrics would say it's safe. And the American Academy of Pediatrics is not only not saying that it's dangerous, but they're starting a Center for Social Media Excellence. So I guess my question to you is, why aren't medical professional associations standing up for kids?
Yeah, thanks for your question. As a scientific association, our responsibility is to represent the science that we have to date on this issue. the science does suggest that there are some kids who do find benefit in their social media use. But let's talk about what kind of social media use we're talking about. We're not talking about algorithms. We're not talking about likes and followers. We're talking about specific populations who have the opportunity to use social media with training, who are able to understand how to use it appropriately with appropriate parental monitoring, and also some gatekeeping that is occurring. In the face of that science, and in addressing Dan's question as well, we cannot support a complete ban against kids from a certain age. If for no other reason, that's simply not how development occurs. Children do not wake up on their 16th birthday suddenly immune from all the possible risks and harms that might occur to them. And I fear that an age gating system not only provides a database of all federally issued government IDs to social media companies, God knows what they would do with that, but it also takes the release off of folks to think that we do not still need to develop competencies. We do not still need to be doing monitoring. We do not still need to be doing education in the school system. The approach that I can only speak for APA, but as I've heard from our colleagues and other scientific and medical associations, is that we need a multi-tiered, systemic, well-rounded approach that follows in the example of what we've done with things like drunk driving or smoking, that has had a Hollywood education component, has had a school-based component, a parent-based component that provides for efficacy and agency, and legal components on top of that. I think anything short of that full approach that's taking into the science fully into account is bound to fail.
And that brings us to the end of our panel. Just to amplify for a moment what you said, we were talking earlier about how, teenagers, my own daughter, when she was a teenager, she's 40 now, they never drove drunk. They got drunk, but there was a designated driver. There are all kinds of messages that have been passed on to kids, which is what you were talking about, that, can have an impact if there's money and resolve behind it. Well, thank you. This was an incredible panel, and I have so many more questions for all of you, and I know you must too, but there are more great panels to come, and thank you very much for being a good audience.